Christmas fruitcake may be one of the most reviled and ridiculed of all holiday baked goods, but it was not always that way. In fact, during the American Civil War, a fruitcake like the one that I'm making today was one of the most popular treats to send to your boys in blue, or gray. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we make fruitcake from the Civil War, this time on Tasting History. The fruitcake as we know it today, that is leavened not with yeast but with baking powder or baking soda, became popular in the mid-19th century. Not leavening it with yeast made it much easier to bake, yet it still stayed for just as long. Basically, fruitcake is the hardtack of cakes. It can stay good for months or even years after baking, which is probably why it was one of the more popular treats to send to soldiers during the American Civil War. In fact, one of the most popular sources for recipes at the time, Goody's Lady's Book, printed their recipe not at Christmas, but in June, so that it would be ready for Christmas. It's for common fruitcake. 2 cups of butter, 2 of molasses, 2 of sugar, 6 eggs, 2 small teaspoonfuls of soda, a little salt, 1 pound of raisins chopped and stoned, 1 of currants, half a pound of citron, flour sufficient to make as stiff as soft gingerbread, spice to taste. Bake in 3 sheets or loaves. Now, fruitcakes are notoriously dense and can be rather dry, so it's commonplace to put some rum or brandy on the cake after baking and kind of let it soak in to keep it nice and moist. But even so, you might want to have something on standby like a cup of coffee to drink from today's sponsor, Trade. Trade is a coffee delivery service that works with over 55 independent roasters to deliver freshly roasted coffee to your doorstep. And the coffees are curated to your tastes and coffee drinking habits. Like this Brazilian coffee roast from Peixoto Coffee in Chandler, Arizona. It's sweet and smooth, which is exactly what I look for in a coffee. And right now, Trade has an option to give the gift of coffee to those coffee lovers in your life with a digital subscription, so it goes right to their inbox. Basically, you buy the subscription, you decide on how much to spend, they get the subscription, and then that person who gets the gift can decide how they like their coffee. And if the coffee lover in your life is you, well, then in the words of Parks and Rec, treat yourself and get a free bag of coffee roasted to order with any subscription purchase. Just go to drinktrade.com/MaxMiller and get a free bag of coffee with the purchase of any subscription. And you can cancel at any time or customize your subscription however you like. That's drinktrade.com/MaxMiller to get some coffee to drink alongside your fruitcake, for which you will need 1 cup or 227 grams of butter, 1 cup or 235 milliliters of molasses, 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, 3 eggs, a teaspoon each of baking soda, salt, nutmeg, mace, and ginger, a half teaspoon of allspice, a half teaspoon of coriander, 1½ teaspoons of cinnamon, a half pound or 225 grams of raisins, a half pound or 225 grams of currants, a quarter pound or 113 grams of citron, and 3 cups or 360 grams of flour. And you'll notice that I'm only making half of the recipe that is called for in Goody's book because it's still gonna make more fruitcake than you probably need. So first, soak your raisins, currants, and citron for a few minutes, and then drain them and toss them with just a little flour. Doing this will help to stop all of the fruit from falling to the bottom of the cake, and I learned this from you. Not you specifically, but you, the audience of Tasting History, because a few years ago, when I did the video on panettone, all of my fruit fell to the bottom of the baked good, and people were like, if you put it in flour first, then it will keep it up and help distribute it better. So that's what I did. And it seems that even in the 1860s, people knew this. I didn't know it until very recently, but in the 1860s, people knew this because one period recipe calls for 2 pounds of washed currants rubbed in flour and mixed into the cake. Always learning new things. Anyway, with the fruit floured, whisk the salt, soda, and spices all together with the rest of the flour, and then beat the butter until it's nice and fluffy. Then add the sugar and cream them together until smooth. Scrape down the sides of the bowl and add the molasses and beat until fully incorporated, and then add the eggs just one at a time, mixing each egg in fully before you add the next. And keep scraping down the sides and bottom of the bowl throughout this process. Then add a few spoonfuls of the flour and spice mixture and gently mix it in until just incorporated, then add a few more and continue to mix this way until all of the flour has been added. Then add about 1/3 of the fruit and mix it in by hand. All of this, of course, can actually be done by hand, but if you are using a stand mixer for the first part of the recipe, Definitely switch to hand now so you don't over mix the flour and make it all gummy. Then continue to add in all the fruit and mix until it's all evenly incorporated. Then add the batter to 2 standardized size loaf pans, which have been well greased with butter or other fat. They should be about half to 2/3 full. Smooth the top as best as you can, and then pop them in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, about 150 Celsius for 2 hours. And start checking it around 90 minutes by inserting a wooden skewer. If the skewer comes out clean, then that means it's done. Also, I wanted to share a question with you that I got a lot while I was out on book tour doing Q&As, and that was, how many times do I practice each recipe? Well, for the cookbook, it was many, many times. I tested them all. I had my Patreon patrons test them all, so they're perfect, I would like to think. But on the show, usually it's a one and done thing. I try to follow the original historic recipe as closely as possible, and then whatever comes from that is what I'm going to taste. But sometimes, especially with baked goods, I know that I made a mistake because, you know, if it's supposed to be a cake and it turns out like a soup, clearly I did something wrong. That's kind of what happened with this the first time that I tried it. I think I probably overbeat the eggs and added a little too much soda because it just spilled out of the pan and all onto the bottom of the oven, and it burned and it was horrible, and yeah, didn't look great. So yeah, all of that to say, if you ever make a mistake in the kitchen, don't sweat it, just try again. But hopefully, since I made the mistake in this episode, you won't have to recreate my mistake. The recipe that I'm giving you is fairly foolproof, so you can just sit back, relax, and listen to me talk about the history of the much hated and maligned fruitcake. Pinning down the origins of fruitcake is not so easy because the term really can refer to so many different things, and it changes over time. But the act of adding fruit to bread-like products goes back to ancient times. The Sumerians had a sort of cake made with dates, raisins, and cheese that were a favorite at the palace of Ur. But these were very much unlike any cake that we would know today, as were the ancient Roman cakes that were made with barley and fruit and sweetened with honey and wine. Again, nothing like a fruit cake today. But it is possible that these fruit bread cake things gave rise to the later practices of adding fruit to different breads popular in the Middle East, North Africa, and medieval Europe. But still, they didn't really look anything like fruitcake today. Some were sugar and flour mixed with different fruits and then boiled, which is the precursor to today's figgy pudding or plum pudding. And then there were those that were baked, like the German Stollen or the panforte from Tuscany. But in these early forms of fruitcake, the fruit was usually dried because that was the best way to preserve the fruit. You pick a cherry, you got like 3 days to eat it before it goes bad. But if you dry that cherry out, you can use it in baked goods throughout the year. The other way to preserve fruit was with honey or sugar, but especially in Europe in the Middle Ages, sugar was so expensive that very few people could afford to do that. Sugar had to come all the way from the Far East, or else some places in North Africa grew it, and so getting enough to preserve fruit was not really an option for most people. And nor was using a lot of spices because those also had to come from very far away. But that all changed in the 16th and 17th century. All of a sudden being like 200 years, all of a sudden the spices and sugar became more available because they could be grown in the New World, which was considerably closer than the Far East. They were still luxury items, but not so much so that you had to be nobility to afford them. So it was during this time that more people began preserving their fruit in sugar and could bake cakes with spices. Recipes for these cakes begin appearing in cookbooks like La Varenne's 1651 Le Pâtissier François, which really gave birth to the modern pastry as we know it. In England, Robert May published a recipe for an extraordinary good cake, which called for flour, butter, and cream to be mixed with currants, sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger, and then baked into a cake. I do love that following the recipe for an extraordinary good cake, he gives a recipe to make a cake other ways. You'd think he would build up to the best extraordinary cake, but he didn't. Whatever. Anyway, the big difference between these fruitcakes and modern fruitcakes were the fact that they were yeasted. That is how they rose. They used ale barm or other types of yeast to rise the cake instead of baking powder, baking soda, other chemical leaveners that we use today. The issue there is that yeast is not as easy to use, and they still tended to be a little bit more dense even than our fruitcake today. But that was fruitcake for the next 200 years. And that became the cake to make at Christmas time and at other special times of the year. And they actually became the wedding cake for the 18th and 19th century. I did an entire video on the history of wedding cakes or bride cakes, and I talk about how the fruit cake was the standard wedding cake of the period, especially after Queen Victoria made it popular. She had a fruit cake and then iced it with white royal icing, and that is the wedding cake that really became standard for a long time, especially in the royal family, and that continues to today. Queen Elizabeth II, fruitcake. The wedding of Charles and Diana, fruitcake. Even at the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton, they had fruitcake. So if you didn't get an invite, don't worry, that's okay. And while it's still eaten at royal weddings, I feel like what kept fruitcake alive today is the holidays, Christmas time. In England, it was popular to eat as Twelfth Night cake, which then became Christmas cake, and it was famous for its longevity. Even as far back as 1817, Dr. William Kitchener wrote, "A good twelfth cake, not baked too much and kept in a cool, dry place, will retain its moisture and eat well if 12 months old." One example of these fruitcakes lasting a very long time comes from the early 20th century. In 1910, Robert Falcon Scott led the Terra Nova expedition to the Antarctic regions, and among his provisions was a Huntley and Palmer's fruitcake. Being dense and calorie-laden, it made for a perfect ration to bring along on the expedition. Unfortunately, they seem to have left it behind at base camp when they went to the actual South Pole, because on their return trip from the South Pole, they all starved to death and died from exposure. Over 100 years later, in 2017, the fruitcake was found, and in relatively good condition. In fact, the cake itself was in better condition than the tin box that it was kept in. But as Kitchener had said, these cakes would keep well in a cool and dry place, and there ain't no place cooler and drier than Antarctica. Now, it was around this same period that sending your fruitcake through the mail really took off, because in 1913, the US Postal Service began parcel post. And it was an instant success, and among many other items, fruitcakes became one of the most popular things to ship. You bake a cake, you pop it in the mail, and your Christmas shopping is done. And then it got even easier shortly afterward, because then you didn't even need to bake the cake, you could buy it. Most sources agree it was the Collins Street Bakery in Corsicana, Texas, who first decided to start packaging their fruitcakes specifically for mail order. Fancy cakes in fancy tins filled the mailrooms of the US Postal Service, and more companies got in on the action, like the Claxton Bakery in Claxton, Georgia, who calls itself the fruitcake capital of the world. Sales continued to boom throughout the 1950s, and these fruitcake producers thought that the success would never end. But they were all of them deceived. For another cake was made, deep from the pages of Betty Crocker, in the fires of American ovens, housewives baked a new cake, the chiffon cake. The light and airy texture of the chiffon and the other sponge cakes that were being made at the time, especially those coming out of boxes from places like Duncan Hines, Pillsbury, and Betty Crocker, well, that was becoming the new popular thing on the American palate. And so the dense but rich fruitcake, it just seemed old-fashioned. Now, whether or not it's better or worse, that's a matter of opinion. But old-fashioned, well, that is a matter of fact. Now, this change in the American palate for different types of cakes didn't happen overnight. In fact, during the Apollo 11 mission to the moon, they brought a fruitcake with them. They were cut into cubes to minimize crumbs and then vacuum packed and sealed very tightly. The thing is, it doesn't seem that they actually ate them, because you can still see those same Apollo 11 cakes in the Smithsonian today. What is cool is that the newspapers of the day printed the recipe for these fruitcakes. In fact, in 1972, just as the last manned mission to the moon was about to happen, one newspaper printed the recipe saying the Apollo 17 astronauts kept munching on their own special fruitcake during man's last planned mission to and from the moon. You might want to put it on your Christmas surprise menu. Now that was in 1972, and the fall of the fruitcake was definitely on the precipice. In the 1950s, it was touted as a holiday must. But by the 1980s, one survey put fruitcake as the least wanted gift by 75% of the people polled. Now, if there is anyone that could be said to have really made fruitcake a punchline, it was Johnny Carson. On one of his shows, he told a joke that said, "There is only one fruitcake in the entire world, and people keep passing it around." This became a running gag, and every year he would make fun of fruitcakes, doing things like dropping a fruitcake onto his desk and then having the desk crumble beneath its weight. Funny, yes, but at what cost? At the cost of the popularity of the fruitcake? Well, maybe not, because even today, well over 2 million fruitcakes are sold every year in the US during the holidays. But I know that you will not be buying a fruitcake this year, because instead you'll be baking your own using this recipe from the era of the American Civil War. So once the skewer comes out clean, remove the cakes from the oven, and while they're still hot, brush a healthy amount of brandy or rum on top. This isn't something you must do, but it is traditional, and you can actually brush a bit more on every day or so until you eat the cake, or at least for the first few weeks. Now, after the cakes have cooled on a cooling rack, they are technically ready to eat, but fruitcake aficionados say that they should be seasoned for at least a month or even up to a year. But I'm not waiting a year or even a month, so I'm going to try it right now. And here we are, a Christmas fruitcake from the 1860s. Y'all, I'm just so proud that the fruit and the flour thing worked. The fruit is perfectly throughout the loaf. Super proud of that. Thank you to everyone on the Panettone episode who commented on how to do this. Love learning new things. So it's a tight crumb, as they say in the cake baking world. It's gonna be pretty dense. I mean, it's pretty heavy cake. It's pretty heavy. It's not like crazy heavy, but it's heavy for a cake. So I'm just gonna take a bite and we'll see how it is. It's super flavorful. I'll give it that. The fruit comes through, the spices really come through. I used a lot of spices because I wanted it to be a heavily spiced cake. The fruit is, I mean, it kind of has the flavor of like a plum pudding, a Christmas pudding or something like that. It's the same flavor profile, it's just because it's baked, it's a very, very different texture. It is kind of dry. I think if I put more brandy or whatever on it over, the next few days, it would moisten up. It's not like crumbly dry, it's more just, it's just so dense that it's not the texture of cake that I would typically eat today. And that's why it's no longer as popular as it used to be. It's just been usurped by a nicer texture cake, at least in my opinion. But the flavor is really, really nice. And the thing is, I think with a cup of coffee or a glass of brandy, it would actually be really nice. I could eat a couple pieces. I think it grows on you already. Just the flavor lingers for a very long time. It's really nice. It is old-fashioned, but it's tasting history, so what'd you expect? So there's one more story about specifically Civil War era fruitcake that I wanted to share with you, and it comes out of Macon, Georgia. Early in the war, a young soldier from Macon named Abner T. Holt got sick and was cared for by Dr. Charles Couch in Virginia. That Christmas of 1861, the first Christmas of the war, he received a fruitcake that Mrs. Couch had baked for him and sent to him. And he got another one the next year as well. Then, in 1863, he was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg, and he convalesced for several months again at the home of Dr. Couch and his wife. After 2 months, he was able to come home, and every Christmas since then, those good friends have sent him the box with a nice fruitcake in it as a Christmas remembrance. Every year, back down in Macon, the cake arrived around the holidays, And it became such a thing, and Macon, I guess, was such a small town, that the Macon Telegraph, the local newspaper, started printing headlines like, "His annual cake, Mr. A.T. Holt receives his 38th reminder of Virginia friends." And even after both men and Mrs. Couch had died, the families continued to exchange fruitcakes all the way up through the 1920s. So just remember, if you are planning on baking a fruitcake this year and giving it to someone, it might be a 6-decade-long commitment. So just keep that in mind and have a wonderful holiday, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History.